Thank you so much. I'm truly honored to be receiving this award on behalf of the ACLU. And in case you don't know exactly when the Palmer raids happened, I'll tell you that the ACLU will be celebrating its centennial next year in 2020. And you probably also know that we don't only do LGBT work, we do about 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties that we regard as interconnected. But where I have to take issue with your wonderful introduction is we date our LGBT work not back to the founding of our project in 1986, to way before Stonewall, but to 1936, when we represented Lillian Hellman's play, The Children's Hour, which had been literally banned in Boston. And I think it is no coincidence that we date our work back to First Amendment work, because it seems to me that the first step toward full freedom and equality was to loosen the grip of the notion that there was a love that dared not speak its name. So when the Children's Hour was banned in Boston, it was ACLU lawyers who helped the publisher go to federal court and challenge the ban. Now, I'm sorry to say that back then we lost the case, but we won the battle of public opinion. And that was the first time that there were serious limitations imposed on the censor in Boston. So I'll now skip ahead to a couple of decades to the mid-1950s, when again the ACLU turned to the First Amendment to defend Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who you may know was the beat poet and the owner of San Francisco City Lights bookstore, when he was charged with obscenity, the crime of obscenity, for publishing Allen Ginsberg's book of poetry, Howl, and other poems. And of course, the reason that that was considered obscene is that it had unapologetic references to gay sex. So ACLU lawyers quoted Balzac, Shakespeare, the Bible, as other works that had erotic content, and they won a complete acquittal. So I think at this point you can start to say free speech was becoming possible. So from then on, from the 1950s, the ACLU and its affiliates, we have 50 affiliates all around the country. There weren't quite so many in the 1950s. But the ACLU litigated a steady stream of cases involving laws targeting gay bars, laws prohibiting cross-dressing in public, and police harassment of gay rights activists. Again, the First Amendment coming to bat for incipient equality. So I will tell you that in the 1950s, the National ACLU was not ready to take on some of the prevailing orthodoxy in other areas, like denials of security clearances to people who were said to be vulnerable to blackmail, challenges to sodomy laws, but our affiliates led the way. And by 1963, still years before Stonewall, the ACLU was challenging discriminatory deportations and even consensual sodomy laws in 1963. The ACLU began litigating employment discrimination and denials of security clearances during the 1970s, brought its first challenge to an anti-gay military policy in 1970. And that same decade, we began our work in the area of discriminatory family law, including defense of a gay father who was denied visitation with his children in a case called Voller versus Voller. And of course, that work has continued. Our work in marriage equality, I was just telling somebody, dates back to the early 1970s in a Minnesota case brought by the ACLU of Minnesota called Baker versus Nelson, which resulted in a 1972 Supreme Court case which denied the right of Jack Baker and Michael McConnell to get married. So it was going to take the Supreme Court over 4 decades to get that one right. So as you were mentioning, the ACLU did start a dedicated LGBT rights project in the ACLU's national office with Nan Hunter as the first director in 1986. And I want to tell you that that project opened on June 1st, 1986. Do you remember what happened at the end of June 1986? The Supreme Court came out with its miserable opinion in Bowers versus Hardwick, our challenge to the consensual sodomy law in Georgia, in which the majority said that any claim that anyone has what they called a right to homosexual sex had to be facetious. So I was just saying, one of the members of our board at that time was Tom Stoddard, who was director of Lambda. And I will never forget, Tom gave a speech at our biennial leadership conference, the first one I ever went to, the following year. And what he said was, well, maybe it's for the best. He said, if the Supreme Court had top-down ruled that consensual sodomy laws are unconstitutional, there probably would have been backlash. He said, now we're going to have to do it the hard way. We're going to have to change public opinion. We're going to have to start from the ground up. We're going to have to do grassroots organizing. And maybe we're going to come up with something that's going to stick. So there was a lot of work to be done, as we could all tell after the opinion in Bowers versus Hardwick, but it was actually only 17 years, a really very short time, before Lawrence versus Texas, when the court reversed Bowers versus Hardwick. So that was a real landmark. So the director of our LGBT and HIV project today, as many of you know, is James Essex. James. And the reason we're all applauding James is that the work that you're honoring here tonight was done by James and his predecessors, both Nan and Matt Coles, and their staffs. And so that's, who's actually been doing the work. But I also want to note that we could not have done this work. It's not just the great lawyers who make these cases, it is the great and courageous clients. We have had so many clients over the years who had no desire to be civil rights, civil liberties heroes or activists. Take Gavin Grimm. He just wanted to go to the bathroom. But Gavin, like so many of our clients, have accepted the role that history has foisted upon them. And Gavin has accepted his role now as a leading activist and spokesperson for trans people. The other thing I want to say is that we could not have won so many cases if they had only been our cases. So I was already mentioning that we've certainly worked in partnership with Lambda. Jaime might like to admit that she was on our staff. She was legislative counsel to the HIV project, where she got to write part of the ADA, and later on was part of the national board. So if you take marriage equality as a perfect example of why nothing happens, as Judith Butler once said, we are wordless without each other. So this is why we need everybody. So Edie Windsor was our client. And she was also the client of Roberta Kaplan at Paul Weiss, who successfully argued on her behalf in the Supreme Court. Jim Obergefell was our client, but there were 3 companion cases there from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, with a very large cast of characters involved, including a lot of people from ACLU affiliates, and also including essentially Mary Bonato of GLAAD, and how can we not mention Evan Wilson, the Captain Ahab of marriage equality, right? For how many years? 32 years Evan spent as founding director and then just tirelessly working as president of Freedom to Marry. The other thing that I want to say is that the battle for equality is not only through litigation. So ACLU affiliates all around the country were involved in lobbying in many states, building up the state law momentum that I think led to the Obergefell decision. Now, the ACLU helped to build that momentum by, among other things, seeking bipartisan support. Believe it or not, we hired Steve Schmidt, John McCain's campaign manager, to explain to Republican state legislators why it was actually in their interest to vote for marriage equality. So, as you all know, that was a pretty successful campaign. The other thing I have to mention is that our communications departments have all been brilliant, too. So one of my favorite examples was, I think, was this before your time, my big gay illegal wedding? Was that on your watch? It was amazing. It was this contest that the ACLU put together to highlight the fact that there was this patchwork of laws around the United States, and they invited any couple who wanted to get married who could not get married in their own state to explain what their ideal wedding would be. One of the ones I liked was people in Arizona who said, we'd rent a hot air balloon and we'd float over into California and then we'd do it. And so it was a contest where the ACLU offered $5,000 toward the expense of the dream wedding to winners of the competition. And people could vote, sort of American Idol style, for who were their favorites. And I have to tell you that, especially when I spoke to groups of young people, high school students, college students, no matter what else I said, if I mentioned that campaign, they said, how do we vote? So hundreds of thousands of people voted for my big gay illegal wedding. So that's how it happens. Now, when I joined the ACLU board in 1988, I could not have believed that we would have had this many successes, or that very often our LGBT work has been part of our feel-good work. It was a place where we could win things, unlike a lot of other areas. Roger Baldwin, one of the principals, the first director of the ACLU, once said that no civil liberties battle ever remains won. And today, sure enough, we're seeing a lot of backlash. We're seeing, the Masterpiece Cake Shop, losing that was, really painful. We're seeing a lot of religious refusal kinds of backlash. We're seeing other kinds of backlash. But I think in this instance, I think that Roger Baldwin's bon mot is really not true. I think demographically, I think we have homophobia on the run. And I don't think it's coming back in full force. I think we have, in fact, won that battle. So I wanted to give the last word tonight to our current Supreme Court client, Amy Stevens. I'm sure most of you know that Amy was fired from her job at a funeral home when she wrote a letter to the director explaining that she had decided to live publicly as the woman who she had always been privately. Now, if you haven't seen it, there is a wonderful little video. Was it produced by the ACLU, James? Or I think it's on the ACLU website. You can also find it on YouTube. It's all the, Laverne Cox and Alan Cummings and other people reading from Amy's letter. And her letter is beautiful, but I just want to quote to you tonight one of her really simple and eloquent statements. She said, "No one should face discrimination because of who they are." I think Eleanor Roosevelt would have agreed, and let's hope the Supreme Court does too. Thank you.